Antarctica, December 1946. The United States mobilized its largest polar deployment, thousands of men, ships and aircraft, backed by a multi-million-dollar budget. The documents listed training, cold weather testing and mapping. For that single objective, the scale was disproportionate. In command was Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd. Task Force 68 set sail on December 2nd toward Queen Maud Land. In just 8 weeks, several men would not return. On March 3, 1947, the operation was cancelled and the fleet withdrew. Veteran pilots reported lights and disc-shaped objects. Radio silence and a single reporting channel were imposed. In Valparaiso, Byrd warned of objects capable of traveling from pole to pole at extreme speeds and was later hospitalized for exhaustion. His diaries remain classified. What mattered most never appeared in the official report. What forced the United States to order such an early withdrawal? Why has a documentary void and silence been maintained for nearly 8 decades? The Secret War in Antarctica. What happened in 1947? 18 months after the end of World War II, the United States approved the largest naval deployment ever sent to Antarctica. The operation, officially named Operation High Jump, mobilized 4,700 personnel, 13 ships and 33 aircraft with an approved budget of $90,1946. The public explanation cited specific technical objectives: training in polar conditions, testing naval and aerial equipment in extreme cold, and systematic cartographic surveys of previously unrecorded areas of the Antarctic continent. However, the structure of the force far exceeded those declared aims. The deployment included a light aircraft carrier, escort destroyers, submarines, icebreakers, tankers and cargo ships, as well as fighter aircraft and reconnaissance planes that had been used in the Pacific until 1945. Command of the expedition was entrusted to Admiral Richard Byrd, a veteran of polar exploration and an officer with direct access to the General Staff. In later documentation, Byrd described the mission as a program to train personnel and validate equipment in polar conditions, but he added an explicit strategic objective: to establish and consolidate a permanent United States presence in key sectors of Antarctica in the context of an emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union. At the same time, the international press amplified persistent rumors that had surfaced after the German surrender. There was talk of Third Reich submarines that had not been accounted for, of prolonged voyages outside recorded routes, and of possible southern refugees never verified. 2 cases fueled these versions: the U-boats U-530 and U-977, which surrendered in Argentina on July 10 and August 17, 1945, after weeks of navigation following the official end of the European conflict. Both crews submitted incomplete logbooks, and their commanders avoided detailing their final movements. The naval force, designated Task Force 68, departed from Norfolk, Virginia on December 2, 1946, heading toward the southern hemisphere during the boreal summer, which meant facing the Antarctic winter. The voyage crossed the southern seas, characterized by continuous circumpolar currents and waves reaching up to 12 meters. On board, temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, with ice accumulating on decks, weapons, and aircraft. Multiple cases of frostbite were recorded among unacclimated personnel. In January 1947, the fleet reached the coast of Queen Maud Land, a region barely mapped and without a permanent United States presence until that moment. The pilots of Task Force 68 were veterans. Most had completed full campaigns in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and the Philippines, and were accustomed to operating in hostile weather under anti-aircraft fire and performing emergency carrier landings. They were personnel trained to maintain discipline under pressure. In February 1947, during reconnaissance flights, several crews described a recurring phenomenon: spherical lights that appeared without warning and remained close to the aircraft for minutes at a time. They described them as luminous points with circular outlines, no visible trail and no perceptible noise, capable of maintaining a constant separation even when the aircraft changed course or altitude. At first, the reports attempted to fit conventional explanations: reflections on ice, halos caused by snow crystals, polar mirages, and optical effects associated with layers of air at different temperatures. The problem was persistence. In the reports, The lights did not dissipate with low clouds, did not disappear during sustained turns, and did not fall behind when the aircraft accelerated. That pattern connected with a wartime precedent. The Foo Fighters, lights reported by Allied crews in the European theatre beginning in 1944, which the press of the time popularized as possible German weapons and which some pilots nicknamed Kraut fireballs. No single cause was ever established, and in military archives they remained described as observations without conclusive identification. In Antarctica, the absence of known enemy forces turned the phenomenon into a different operational problem. It was not combat, it was uncertainty, and that uncertainty began to be felt within the chain of command. The reports escalated when some pilots stated that in addition to lights, they had detected larger objects during brief windows. Circular or elongated shapes with no visible aerodynamic features, observed at a distance and lost from sight without a clear trajectory. In more than one case, the immediate interpretation was instrumental, interference, false readings, but the fact that different crews described similar patterns meant the observations were no longer treated as isolated anecdotes. Byrd's response was strict, absolute radio silence regarding any sighting and a single reporting channel. Incidents were to be communicated only internally, in person, aboard the USS Mount Olympus, the command ship of the task force. The priority became information control within the expeditionary force itself. What could justify such a confidentiality protocol in a mission that, on paper, was devoted to training and mapping? On February 26, 1947, Day 54 of Operation High Jump, a squadron of 6 Corsair fighters took off from the USS Philippine Sea for a standard aerial photography mission. The assigned objective was to map a coastal strip of Queen Maud Land, marked on German maps from 1938 as a geologically anomalous zone with cavities visible from the air. The takeoff was executed without incident. Weather conditions were unusually favorable: clear skies, wide visibility, and steady winds. During the first minutes, the mission proceeded as planned. 30 minutes later, the control tower lost radio contact with the formation leader, Captain Dave Bunger. The final transmissions were brief and fragmented, disrupted by static, references to unidentified objects described as multiple and disc-shaped, before communication was cut completely. Attempts to re-establish the link failed. An immediate search procedure was activated. Shortly afterward, the squadron was located returning to the carrier in tight formation, maintaining direct course and constant speed. All 6 Corsairs landed in succession. The pilots exited their cockpits visibly shaken. According to internal reports, several showed clear signs of acute stress incompatible with the usual strain of polar flight. Bunger exhibited persistent tremors not attributable to the cold. The contents of the subsequent debriefing were classified and never officially released. Years later, indirect testimonies described a specific sequence. Upon reaching the assigned zone, onboard radar systems allegedly detected several simultaneous contacts. Initially, these were interpreted as interference. Seconds later, they were observed visually. The descriptions matched: disc-shaped objects estimated in number between 8 and 10, appearing to emerge from the coastal line near the cavities. They displayed no immediate aggressive posture. They held relative position, forming an arc around the squadron. Bunger attempted to break contact through evasive maneuvers. The objects mirrored each change of course without altering distance or cohesion. At that moment, one of them emitted a concentrated luminous flash that struck the right wing of the Corsair piloted by Lieutenant Bill Kearns. No explosion or ballistic impact was recorded. The wing lost structural integrity progressively. Kearns reported loss of control and an uncommanded descent. With no known engagement parameters, Bunger ordered an immediate withdrawal. The squadron headed toward open sea. The objects maintained pursuit for approximately 2 minutes, preserving an estimated separation of 500 meters before disappearing without any observable trajectory. Kearns managed to keep his aircraft operational until reaching the carrier and executed an emergency landing with the landing gear partially deployed. Subsequent technical inspection identified severe deformation of the metal with no combustion residue or burn marks. The official report attributed the incident to mechanical failure caused by extreme cold conditions. The pilots did not share that conclusion. In their internal accounts, the encounter had been real, and the response immediate. The secret of Task Force 68, the victims who never returned. According to public records of the United States Navy, the mission was an exemplary success. Thousands of square kilometers were mapped, more than 70,000 aerial photographs were taken, geological samples were collected, and equipment was tested under extreme conditions. The only casualties officially acknowledged were described as minor accidents caused by the polar climate. But the numbers do not add up. Personnel manifests indicate that 4,700 men departed from Norfolk in December 1946. When Task Force 68 returned to the United States, only 4,683 appeared on the disembarkation lists. 17 men did not return. The first incident occurred on December 30, 1946, barely 4 weeks after the operation began. The Martin Mariner seaplane, operationally designated George 1, disappeared during a reconnaissance flight over sea ice near Thurston Island. On board were Lieutenant Ralph LeBlanc, an aviation mechanic, and a radio operator. The official report states that the aircraft suffered a catastrophic engine failure and crashed into the ocean. No wreckage was recovered. No bodies were recovered. Years later, Frederick J. Honkeler, a radar technician aboard the USS Pine Island, stated that George 1 had reported by radio that it was being followed by unknown objects and that its instruments were beginning to fail. According to Honkeler, its last words were, "They're very close. The instruments aren't responding." On the Pine Islands radar, the aircraft's echo did not descend. It simply vanished. Honkeler remained silent for nearly 4 decades. As he explained in 1985, all radar operators had signed classified confidentiality agreements. Speaking meant court-martial. When he finally spoke, his testimony was neither denied nor confirmed. It was simply ignored. On January 9, 1947, the second serious incident occurred. A Sikorsky helicopter was lost during a flight between the USS Currituck and the temporary base Little America 4. On board were Lieutenant Commander John Howell, the chief metallurgist, and the meteorological specialist. The official report indicated an operational accident and burial at sea according to protocol. However, none of the 3 appear buried at Arlington or in any known military cemetery. Mechanical engineer Owen McCarty, embarked on the Currituck, recorded a different version in his personal diary, published by his family in 2003. According to McCarty, the helicopter did not crash. It executed an intact emergency landing after a total and simultaneous electrical failure. When the rescue team arrived, the aircraft was complete. No impacts, no structural damage. All 3 crew members were dead inside the cabin. There were no visible injuries. There were no signs of struggle. There was no obvious explanation. The task force physician, according to McCarty, diagnosed simultaneous cardiac arrest of unknown cause. All 3 men had died at the same time. McCarty wrote, "I have seen men die in combat, from illness and in accidents. I had never seen anything like this." The bodies were wrapped and thrown into the sea that same night. There was no ceremony. There were no photographs. There was no detailed communique. The most disturbing episode occurred on February 22, 1947. Another PBM Mariner, identified as George 3, took off from the Currituck for a photographic mission over the interior of the continent. On board were 9 men, all war veterans. The weather was perfect. No storms, no strong winds, total visibility. The aircraft reported its position every 30 minutes. The first 2 communications were normal. In the third, the pilot's voice changed. "We have visual contact with an unidentified formation. They are approaching, requesting instructions." The tower ordered the mission aborted and a return. There was no response. For the next 6 hours, contact attempts failed. Search flights were deployed over an area of more than 500 square kilometers. Absolutely nothing was found. No wreckage, no impact signs, no fuel stains. George 3 simply disappeared with its 9 crewmen. The official report attributed the loss to adverse weather conditions and a possible collision with uncharted terrain. But meteorological records for that day indicate clear skies. And the area flown over was a flat ice plain, without mountains. Families received standard telegrams from the Department of the Navy. Died in classified military operations. Body not recovered. No details, no explanations. In total, 17 men dead or missing in less than 8 weeks. By comparison, the United States Antarctic expedition of 1939 to 1941 also led by Byrd, lasted 14 months and recorded no casualties. James Clark Ross's expedition in the 19th century had 3 deaths in 4 years. High jump had 17. In his memoirs, Byrd devoted barely 2 paragraphs to the mission's regrettable accidents. He mentioned no names. He explained no circumstances. The complete medical reports remain classified. Those 17 lives would have been erased from the official narrative. The question remains, what was really happening in Antarctica to produce such a number of losses on a supposedly scientific mission? And above all, why does the silence continue nearly 8 decades later? The terrifying warning of Admiral Byrd in 1947 and the flight of the United States. On March 3, 1947, Operation High Jump was cancelled by direct order of the senior United States Naval Command. Task Force 68 received clear and immediate instructions: abandon Antarctica without delay. No explanatory statement was issued. Full recovery of deployed material was not authorized. Several temporary bases were left behind with tons of fuel, scientific equipment, disassembled aircraft, and still operational supplies, something unusual even for an emergency withdrawal. The retreat was carried out without formal objection from subordinate commanders. The chain of command understood that the order allowed no debate. Logistically, the decision was costly, strategically irreversible. Aboard the command ship, the USS Mount Olympus, the behavior of the operations commander Richard E. Byrd drew the attention of his own staff. During the return voyage, Byrd remained isolated in his cabin. He barely participated in operational meetings. He delegated functions he normally handled personally. Officers who served under his command later stated that he slept little, ate irregularly, and avoided any conversation not strictly technical. He did not discuss the cancellation. He did not explain the reasons. He limited himself to confirming orders and signing dispatches. Before crossing the Strait of Magellan, the fleet made a logistical stop in Valparaiso, Chile. It was there that an episode occurred that was not foreseen by any protocol. Against the recommendations of his staff and without explicit authorization from Washington, Byrd accepted an improvised press conference with local journalists. It was neither a planned nor a controlled appearance. Those present described his demeanor as tense, restrained, and visibly different from the experienced explorer who had dealt with the press for decades. Correspondent Lee Heerden van der Bilge of the newspaper El Mercurio recorded his statements, published on March 5, 1947. Byrd stated that the United States had to adopt defensive measures against the possibility of attacks originating from polar regions, and added that, in a future conflict, the country could be reached by objects capable of traveling from pole to pole at extreme speeds. The choice of words was precise and unsettling. Byrd did not speak of airplanes, nor bombers, nor known technology. He spoke of objects. During the same appearance, he expanded his warning. He declared that he had observed phenomena that escaped the prevailing scientific understanding, and that there were active forces at both ends of the planet that did not appear in any strategic model known to the armed forces. He gave no technical details. He did not explicitly mention Antarctica. But the context was unequivocal. The statement spread rapidly through South American and Australasian media. Within days, fragments of the interview were reproduced in outlets in Argentina, Brazil, and Australia, all highlighting the same element: a United States admiral publicly warning of an unidentified polar threat. The official reaction was immediate. Officials from the Department of State contacted the editorial board of El Mercurio directly, requesting clarifications and downplaying the content. It was argued that Byrd had been misunderstood, that his words had been taken out of context, and that his physical condition after weeks of operations under extreme conditions might have affected his speech. No formal retraction by the admiral was issued, only an administrative reinterpretation of his words. The correction did not stop the dissemination. The message had already crossed borders. Upon his arrival in the United States, Byrd did not return to his home or to his Navy office. He was transferred directly to the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. The official diagnosis was extreme exhaustion. He remained hospitalized for nearly 2 months. During that period, he received frequent and prolonged visits from naval intelligence officers, Pentagon representatives, and civilian personnel not listed in public records. No declassified minutes of those meetings exist. After his medical discharge, the change was evident. Byrd cancelled interviews, declined conference invitations, and avoided any public mention of Antarctica. When the press insisted, he repeated a brief, uniform, and carefully measured statement. Operation High Jump had been a successful mission of military training and scientific exploration. He added nothing more. In 1956, almost a decade later, Byrd returned to the frozen continent at the head of Operation Deep Freeze, this time with reinforced security protocols, expanded military presence, and much stricter information control. Among the sectors once again included in operations was Queen Maud Land, the same region visited during High Jump. The detailed content of that expedition was never explained by Byrd. He died in 1957 at the age of 68, officially of a heart attack. His personal diaries related to High Jump and Deep Freeze have not been published and remain classified. Among the most controversial materials associated with Operation High Jump is a document whose mere circulation has generated persistent divisions among researchers for decades. In 1995, 48 years after High Jump, a manuscript began circulating on the internet titled The Lost Diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, February 1947. The text presented itself as a personal record attributed to Byrd, centered on a flight dated February 19, 1947, 3 days before Task Force 68 abruptly restricted all aerial operations over the interior of the continent. According to the document, Byrd took off from the USS Philippine Sea aboard an R-4D, the naval version of the DC-3, accompanied by a co-pilot and under orders to conduct an interior reconnaissance intended to identify possible emergency landing zones. The mission described fits, in formal terms, with routine tasks within the logistical framework of High Jump and is not initially presented as an exceptional operation. The diary states that at around 9 a.m., Byrd observed on the horizon a mountain range not recorded on the maps available on board. What caught his attention was not only its presence, but its unusually regular geometry, described as incompatible with normal geological processes. 30 minutes later, the narrative enters an anomalous technical phase. The compass begins to spin without stable reference, the gyrocompass loses alignment, the radio becomes inoperative, and the response of the controls ceases to correspond with the aircraft's movements. The text claims that the R-4D then approached a broad depression in the terrain, described as an ice-free valley with temperate temperatures and visible vegetation. Byrd notes that the observed landscape did not correspond to any known geographical, climatic, or glaciological model for Antarctica, even under the most extreme hypotheses accepted in 1947. From that point on, the diary offers a progressive description of actively flowing rivers, forested areas, and fauna identified as similar to species extinct since prehistoric times. The observations are presented as direct, low-altitude records, not as symbolic interpretations or theoretical inferences. The manuscript records the appearance of disc-shaped aerial objects, metallic with no visible aerodynamic surfaces and bearing inscriptions the author claims not to recognize. The objects approached the aircraft and positioned themselves in close formation, flanking it on both sides. At that moment, according to the text, all instruments became completely inoperative, and the R-4D began to move without effective response to the controls, as if it were being guided by an external system. The landing described was not forced. Byrd characterizes it as controlled, stable, and precise, executed without conscious intervention by either the pilot or the co-pilot. It is at this point that the document enters its most controversial section. Byrd claims to have been received by individuals of human appearance, of great height, Nordic features, and command of English with an unidentified foreign accent. He describes movement through extensive underground facilities, illuminated by a constant light source that cast no shadows and produced no perceptible heat, and that did not correspond to any conventional electrical system known at the time. The central encounter of the account occurs with a figure referred to in the text as the Master. According to the diary, this entity conveyed a direct warning linked to humanity's use of nuclear weapons in 1945, stating that those detonations had been detected and considered a threat of planetary scope. The message attributed to the conversation is clear. Human weapons development had reached a critical threshold that had to be stopped. The diary maintains that Byrd was escorted back to his aircraft and accompanied until leaving the area. During the ascent, the instruments gradually regained functionality. When looking back, the described environment, the valley, the vegetation, the formations had disappeared, replaced once again by the continuous ice of the Antarctic continent. The landing on the USS Philippine Sea is said to have occurred approximately 3 hours after takeoff within a margin compatible with the R4D's range. The text adds a significant detail. The co-pilot did not recall any anomalous event and described the flight in the routine report as completely normal. The final diary entry is dated March 11, 1947. In it, Byrd claims to have met with high-level Pentagon personnel, to have recounted what happened, and to have received an explicit order to maintain absolute silence under threat of military sanctions, loss of rank, and professional discredit through questioning of his mental state. That is where the document ends. What is significant is not only the diary's content, but what happens afterward. From February 1947 onward, Richard E. Byrd never again carried out personal deep reconnaissance flights over the Antarctic interior, despite the operation continuing for several more weeks and despite his rank allowing him to do so. This decision is not explained in any known operational report. After returning to the United States, Byrd stopped keeping personal diaries, something unusual for an officer who had meticulously documented all his previous expeditions. His private records after high jump disappear entirely from the personal archive held by the Navy. When he was appointed commander of Operation Deep Freeze in 1956, Byrd accepted the position, but his role was limited to strategic supervision from coastal bases without direct participation in long-range flights over the continental interior. For an aerial explorer whose career had been defined precisely by that type of mission, the change was radical. That same year, after a brief public statement in which he asserted that Antarctica contained secrets about the planet that could not be openly discussed, Byrd was removed from all media interaction related to the continent. From then on, any reference by him to high jump or deep freeze was channeled exclusively through official statements. After his death in 1957, the personal diaries linked to polar operations were withdrawn from the academic circuit by direct order of the Department of Defense and transferred to permanent military custody. There is no scheduled date for declassification. Since February 1947, something permanently altered Richard E. Byrd's operational, documentary, and public conduct, and that alteration was never reversed. What did they bring back from Antarctica? The wave of unidentified objects. 3 months after the return of Task Force 68, the United States entered an unprecedented phase of documented anomalous aerial activity. These were not isolated incidents or local rumors, but a sustained wave of sightings reported by civilians, pilots, and military personnel across multiple states. On June 24, 1947, civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold was flying his light aircraft near Mount Rainier in the state of Washington when he observed 9 bright objects moving in formation. Arnold estimated their speed by comparing them with his own aircraft and known ground references. His estimate exceeded 1,900 kilometers per hour, a figure unattainable for any operational aircraft at the time. Arnold described the motion as irregular but coordinated, with abrupt accelerations and course changes without any apparent loss of speed. He compared their movement to saucers skipping over water. The next day, a journalist used that expression as the headline. The term flying saucers became fixed in public culture. Between March and June 1947, more than 200 reports of unidentified flying objects were recorded in the United States. The reports described metallic disks, luminous spheres, and elongated objects, all characterized by extreme speeds, an absence of visible control surfaces, and maneuvers incompatible with known aerodynamics. The geographic pattern was consistent. Most sightings were concentrated in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, and California. Exactly the coastal corridor where units of Task Force 68 had sailed and docked after their return from the Southern Hemisphere. For military analysts, that detail did not go unnoticed. On July 8, 1947, barely 2 weeks after the Arnold case, the incident occurred that forced a direct institutional reaction: Roswell, New Mexico. A local farmer found scattered metallic debris on his property. The discovery was reported to the local air base. That same day, the base issued an official statement claiming it had recovered a flying disc. Hours later, the statement was withdrawn and replaced by another version, a weather balloon. The retraction failed to close the case. Witnesses who saw the debris before it was confiscated described extremely light, resilient materials, impossible to cut or burn, and bearing unidentifiable symbols. Some stated they had observed small bodies of non-human morphology removed quickly by military personnel. Those testimonies were not incorporated into the final reports. The government response was immediate and uniform. Roswell was classified as a communication error. Witnesses were discredited, pressured, or silenced. The episode was officially closed. In September 1947, faced with a sustained accumulation of reports from both civilians and military personnel, the United States Air Force was forced to act officially. These were no longer scattered rumors, but incidents recorded by trained pilots, radar operators, and qualified observers, some of them supported by instrument data. That month, Project Sign was created, the first formal government initiative intended to analyze unidentified aerial phenomena. The project was assigned to the Air Technical Intelligence Center, the unit responsible for evaluating foreign technological threats. Its composition reflected the seriousness of the initial approach: intelligence analysts, aeronautical engineers, propulsion specialists, physicists, and officers with access to high-level classified material. From the beginning, Sign worked under a clear premise: determine whether the observed objects represented a threat to national security. Reports from military pilots, radar recordings, aerial photographs, and technical testimonies were reviewed. A significant portion of the material came from bases on the West Coast and the Pacific Corridor, matching the wave that began after the return of Task Force 68. In 1948, after nearly a year of analysis, the Sign team produced an internal synthesis document known as the Estimate of the Situation. The report evaluated different hypotheses: misidentifications, atmospheric phenomena, experimental Soviet technology, and secret United States projects. None of them coherently explained the strongest set of cases. The report's conclusion was direct: the observed objects could not be attributed to any known human technology. The text did not use the term extraterrestrial in a sensational way, but it explicitly ruled out both Soviet origin and any domestic development. From a military standpoint, that implied a critical gap in aerial control. The document was immediately classified. It reached the desk of the then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Hoyt Vandenberg. The reaction was blunt. Vandenberg rejected the conclusion, citing insufficient conclusive evidence. However, his decision was not to request more data, expand the study, or strengthen the investigation with new resources. He ordered the report removed from internal circulation and blocked its dissemination even within the Air Force itself. No independent technical review was authorized, no cross-check was requested with other scientific departments, no follow-up line was opened. Soon afterward, Project Sign was dissolved. In its place, Project Grudge was created with an explicit shift in focus. It was no longer about determining the origin of the objects, but about reducing the public perception of the phenomenon. New reports were to prioritize conventional explanations, minimize complex cases, and dismiss those that could not be resolved quickly. The change was not technical, it was strategic. Even so, sightings did not stop. Reports continued arriving from air bases, commercial routes, and coastal regions. The phenomenon persisted while the official posture moved toward administrative denial. Over time, the sequence of events became difficult to ignore even within intelligence circles. At no point was a direct connection between these facts acknowledged, but neither was a formal denial issued explicitly separating them. The result was a controlled narrative void, a management of silence. The question was no longer local or anecdotal. It had acquired global scope and strategic dimensions. What had Task Force 68 really found beneath Antarctic ice that within months led the Air Force to move from investigating a possible unknown threat to deciding it was better not to know? Antarctic Treaty. Why is the richest continent in the world off limits? In December 1946, the United States had been systematically interrogating German scientists and technicians captured after the fall of the Third Reich for more than a year. These were not only rocket engineers or conventional weapons experts. Among the detainees were theoretical physicists, aeronauts, advanced propulsion engineers, and systems designers whose lines of work did not fit any known Allied technological program. Over months of classified interrogations, unsettling patterns began to emerge. Several of those scientists described physical principles not found in Western manuals nor in Soviet ones. They were not talking about incremental improvements to existing engines, but entirely different approaches: generating lift without wings, controlling motion without aerodynamic surfaces, propulsion without visible combustion. Operation Paperclip is often presented publicly as the program that brought Wernher von Braun and his Peenemünde team to the United States. That version is partial. Between 1945 and 1959, the United States government recruited, transferred, and employed more than 1,600 German scientists and technicians, many of them connected to experimental projects that never reached large-scale deployment. Some came from underground facilities evacuated in haste. Others claimed to have worked on programs cancelled before the end of the war, whose files were never recovered. One of those names was Victor Schauberger, a self-taught Austrian engineer who had developed systems based on vortex dynamics, implosion, and vacuum generation. His designs did not rely on explosions, combustion, or classic reactive thrust. They explored the idea that motion could be generated by reducing pressure rather than increasing it, a concept contrary to the dominant engineering of the era. United States technicians who examined his prototypes and schematics concluded they could not be reproduced with the industrial means available, not due to a lack of materials, but because the underlying principles were not fully understood. In 1958, Schauberger was brought to Texas to collaborate with a private consortium backed by military contracts. The project was never publicly identified. He returned to Austria months later, ill and ruined, and died that same year. Before he died, he stated that all his designs had been confiscated and that his work had been used without his consent. Another relevant case was Richard Meter, an aeronautical engineer interrogated by the OSS in 1947. Meter described German programs related to disc-shaped vehicles with electromagnetic lift developed in underground facilities near Breslau. According to his testimony, several prototypes had been tested with limited success before the Reich collapsed. Meter provided blueprints, technical memoranda, and flight descriptions. All material was immediately classified. No public technical refutation was issued, nor was the viability of those designs officially confirmed. In 1952, the United States Air Force initiated Project 1794, also known as the AVRO-VZ-9. The objective was explicit and ambitious: to build a disc-shaped vehicle with vertical takeoff, hovering capability, and supersonic performance. The budget allocated between 1952 and 1961 exceeded $3 million, a significant sum for the time. Among the advisors were scientists brought through Paperclip, although not all names have been declassified. The design relied on conventional turbines and the Coanda effect. On paper, the craft was supposed to reach speeds above 1,500 kilometers per hour. In practice, the prototypes barely managed to rise 1 meter off the ground, were extremely unstable, and did not exceed 56 kilometers per hour without losing control. The energy consumption was unsustainable. In 1961, the project was cancelled. The official conclusion was unequivocal: available human technology did not allow the construction of a functional disc-shaped vehicle. That failure left a contradiction impossible to resolve through the official narrative. If the United States could not do it in 1952 with virtually unlimited resources, what were the pilots of Operation High Jump seeing in 1947? While engineering failed, science began to reveal something unsettling beneath Antarctic ice. In Wilkesland, gravimetric studies initiated in 1962 identified a mass concentration beneath the ice equivalent to a crater 300 kilometers in diameter, comparable to Chicxulub. However, measurements refined by the Grace E satellite showed an irregular density distribution, incompatible with known meteor impacts. In 2016, an international request to carry out deep drilling in the area was rejected by the Antarctic Treaty Committee without any public technical explanation. The region remains untouched. Beneath Lake Vostok, detected in the 1950s, lies a liquid body of water of more than 15,000 square kilometers, isolated for at least 15 million years under nearly 4 kilometers of ice. Although the technical capability had existed for decades, it was not drilled until 2012. Initial samples confirmed microbial life, but the complete results were never fully published. The McMurdo dry valleys, ice-free for at least 8 million years, demonstrated that Antarctica is not a homogeneous block, but a continent with geothermally active, stable, and potentially habitable regions on prolonged geological timescales. German scientists spoke of technology based on principles the United States did not control. The United States attempted to replicate it and failed. 70% of high jump's photographic material remains classified. The most sensitive zones remain undrilled, and no state has ever again deployed a comparable military operation deep into the continent's interior. During the second half of the 20th century, the continent became a space regulated by exceptional multilateral agreements. In 1959, 12 countries signed the Antarctic Treaty, an unprecedented document that prohibited permanent militarization, froze territorial claims, and limited human activity to scientific research. In the heart of the Cold War, direct enemies accepted rules they applied nowhere else on Earth. Over the following decades, the treaty was expanded. In 1991, the Madrid Protocol prohibited the exploitation of mineral resources until at least 2048, despite geological studies indicating the possible existence of oil, gas, uranium, and strategic metals beneath the ice. No other region in the world with such potential was declared untouchable for so long. Today, in 2026, Antarctica remains the most restricted territory on Earth. Scientific bases operate under international oversight. Access to the deep interior of the continent requires multiple government authorizations. Vast areas remain without permanent human presence. And certain areas, especially in sectors historically linked to high jump, continue in practice to be treated as exclusion zones without detailed public justification.